In 1982, Larry Speakes, Ronald Reagan's press secretary, made the administration's first public comments about the AIDS epidemic. Responding to a reporter's questions about AIDS, he spoke in a minimizing and jocular tone. While Speakes' dismissiveness sounds shocking, the most unusual part about the briefing was not Speakes' jokes about the epidemic, but the fact that he mentioned it at all. According to the Washington Post, it was not until September of 1987, 6 years after its emergence, that President Ronald Reagan bothered to address AIDS. By this point, nearly 23,000 Americans were dead. Since, especially at the beginning of the epidemic, AIDS disproportionately infected the gay community, many people were under the impression that it only impacted the gay community, and it was coined the gay plague. As a result of the overwhelming homophobia in the United States at the time, the government not only refused to work towards fighting the disease, they censored the media pertaining to it.
The media have in fact been obsessed for at least 5 years, to my knowledge, with trying to prove that black is white and that disgusting, insulting, revolting garbage produced by obviously sick minds is somehow art, and that this art is worthy of being subsidized and rewarded by and with grants of federal funds, the taxpayers' money, mind you, distributed by the National Endowment for the Arts.
According to the Washington Post, Jesse Helms thought it was disgusting that the government under the National Endowment for the Arts, or NEA, helped fund this AIDS art. Therefore, he worked to defund this program and restricted them from funding art that depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual or excretory activities or organs. Since many museums relied on the NEA for funding, they had to adhere to the restrictions on what they could display. This made it very hard for any art that addressed AIDS to get into museums and therefore into the public eye. Beginning in the 1980s, some American artists, frustrated by government inactivity in response to the AIDS crisis and by government censorship of AIDS media, began to incorporate more meaning into their art in an attempt to raise public awareness about the disease and to pressure the government to take action. These artists were mainly successful in raising awareness as their works helped push the government to create treatments for the disease. Even after the treatments for AIDS were developed, the effect on art proved to be enduring, shifting the art trend in America away from postmodernism towards a more purposely meaningful type of art. Before the emergence of AIDS in America, there was a large trend of postmodernist art, which highlights the death of the artist. This means that the audience is not required to understand the artist's intention for their work to derive meaning from it. And sometimes this work did not even have a message. The point of postmodernist art was to not have a point, to embrace absurdity, irony, and humor to break societal expectations of what art should be. This piece, Untitled by Roy Lichtenstein, is a postmodernist piece. It has no inherent, obvious meaning assigned to it, and allows the viewer to superimpose their own meaning onto the art. The title, or lack thereof, is a very common title for postmodernist art, as it does not even bias the viewer towards a certain interpretation. Since the disease was disproportionately impacting the gay community, and the gay community and the art community largely overlapped, a great mark was left on American art in response to and because of AIDS. Fran Lebowitz, acclaimed author and critic, famously said in an interview with Francesco Clemente, "The first people who died of AIDS were artists. They were also the most interesting people." Because of this large impact of AIDS on the art community, art became a large vector of expression in the discourse about AIDS, but was generally unwelcome and misunderstood by much of the mainstream. Since AIDS artists were not able to get their art into the museums by being overt, but still needed to work their art into the mainstream to spread awareness about the disease, artists who dealt with the topic of AIDS were able to subvert the trend of postmodernism to circumvent the censorship of their art. Through this, the emergence of AIDS signaled a change in American art, from the less personal postmodernism to a more purposefully meaningful expressionist art. Felix Gonzalez Torres used the analogy of these artists as spies, using covert tactics to spread their message. The artists were able to do this because the people educated on postmodernist art did not see the given meaning in the work, as they did not believe there was one. But the average person was able to look at this art without the knowledge of postmodernism and with the context of the artist and the world around them, and understand the actual meaning of the piece. Art Aids America coins this art, poetic postmodernism. One example of this is Untitled, Portrait of Ross in L.A. by Felix Gonzalez Torres. This title follows the formula that many AIDS artwork undertook: untitled and then a clue to the meaning of the work. This structure reflects the very idea that was just referenced, adhering to the anti-expression postmodernist standard by titling the first part untitled, but then in the second half, almost as a footnote, hinting to the true meaning of the piece. According to Art Institute Chicago, here the parenthesed part of the title references Gonzalez Torres' partner, Ross Laycock, who died of AIDS complications. The pile of candy's ideal and initial weight is 175 pounds, referencing the ideal male weight and potentially Ross's weight. The audience has the choice to take candy from the pile, and the museum has the chance to replenish it. By including society as a participant in the development of the AIDS crisis and authority as an all-powerful preventer, Gonzalez Torres is able to frame AIDS as something that is fueled by society rather than something inevitable. Although art pieces that directly addressed the AIDS issue were rarely seen in museums, artists used art in overt ways outside of the museum to express their grief and anger. Art like this, where one immediately understands that the subject of the piece was a primary means of expression for artists on the front lines of the epidemic. As the disease progressed, more and more artists began to address the subject of AIDS in their works, some directly using art to protest. The most notable example of this is the Silence Equals Death campaign. According to HighSnowBody.com, this campaign emerged in 1986 after Avram Finkelstein, Jorge Socaras, Brian Howard, Oliver Johnston, Chris Leone, and Charles Kraloff put their minds together and worked to channel their fury into activism. When Jake Hall interviewed Finkelstein, he states that it was a weird, horrible time in New York, this quiet suffering. In hindsight, it appears that AIDS activism started in 1987 with this big splash, but it was a slow-motion train wreck, which took 6 years of silent suffering before a political response was mounted. The triangle featured on the Silence Equals Death art is a modified version of the upside-down triangle that gay prisoners were forced to wear in Nazi camps. The bottom of the posters read, "Turn anger, fear, grief into action." This poster perfectly and deliberately used morbid and striking words and images to represent the direness of the AIDS crisis. Along with this poster, which was pasted across many cities, we have images like this in the Silence Equals Death project that uses eye-catching images and words to develop a sense of urgency to take action in the public. Keith Haring also raised political awareness about the disease by taking his art to the streets. By doing this, he was able to ensure the accessibility of his message to all and not worry about the guidelines and regulations of the establishment. Even after the AIDS activists and artists successfully coerced the government into funding research for treatments, which made AIDS not a death sentence, expressionism continued to live in American art. Today, in many cases, the lives of artists and their opinions on the world can be seen through the analysis of their art. In an On the Coast interview with Jonathan Katz, Art AIDS America author, they discussed the relevance of the AIDS epidemic in art practices today.
30 years later, do you think AIDS still has an effect on artists' creativity?
I think it does. I think it does in one profound way, which is that AIDS taught us to return to expression, to return to emotion in art. And before AIDS presented, the international standard for art was stuff like minimalism, cold, geometric, intellectual. But the traditional values of art making, those expressive and emotional values, were absent. AIDS brought them back.